Thanks a lot for inviting me to speak. As you're right, I mean, this isn't the only thing I speak on. There's lots of other things I speak on, but this is a subject close to my heart because I've just, through my own sort of investigations over the last few years, I've become to know more and more and more trans people, and and obviously I've got my own history of campaigning on lesbian and gay issues, and so it's become something I've very cared very deeply about. So you might be asking, like, there's a general election on, and there's against most one of those vicious anti-working class governments in the world that we've ever had. And why now? Why this subject? Why now? And it might strike us a bit bizarre that an issue affecting sort of 1% of the population, why on earth are we prioritizing this in the middle of an election campaign? But of course it shouldn't be a major issue. It shouldn't be an issue at all. This should be just one of those things that are taken. People's human rights should just be accepted, and it shouldn't be an issue. It shouldn't be a matter of discussion. But the truth is, the Tories are making an issue. They've deliberately weaponized and invented a culture war at the expense of whipping up prejudice against trans people. Sunak and his allies in the media constantly asking Starmer what a woman is, or whether only women have cervixes, or and Starmer's inability to give a sensible, rounded answer to this as he sort of shuffles around and looks uncomfortable is really embarrassing. It's a mixture of he's embarrassed by the issue and he's ignorant on the issue, and he's obsessed by not saying the wrong thing, or by by trying to triangulate for Tory votes. And so as the Tories have moved on, you've got now, first of all, they had a regulation to out trans kids at school to their parents, which is actually quite dangerous. I mean, by telling everyone, every trans kid at school, if you tell their parents they're trans, that can actually put them in physical danger. Then you've got stopping the use at school automatically of using the correct name and pronouns for school kids. You've got the clampdown on teaching about gender ideology. Now, gender ideology, what the hell that is? Everyone talks about gender ideology as if it's a thing. What they mean is teaching people that trans people exist and they have human rights. It's like Section 28 back in the 80s, when schools were forbidden from talking about gay people. It's all just kind of Section 28 revisited. Section 28 round 2. The latest thing now, trans women, because nobody ever cares about trans men, by the way, but there are such things as trans men. But the attack is on trans women now being housed in hospital wards, in women's hospital wards. Kenny Badenoch is obsessed with banning gender-neutral toilets. So every new building that has to be made, it would be illegal to put gender-neutral toilets in new buildings. I don't know what she has at home, presumably, a different ensuite from her husband. And every day there's something new. Every single day there's a new attack, and it's exhausting. Then you had when Scotland tried to move forward and have us introduce self-ID for changing your gender recognition certificate, which is a purely administrative change. It's like a paperwork exercise for a way of changing your birth certificate or your death certificate. That the Tory government blocked that using some clause of the original Representation of Scotland Act, and now you've got the cash review, which I'll deal with later. With issues like these, lots of issues come up which go against the grain of popular prejudice. Sometimes the Tories see a possibility amongst their own base, and maybe perhaps some others from some other Labour voters, of like forming a wedge and trying to win votes for them on these secondary issues, away from issues of class, of living standards, of cuts, and so on. And it's tempting for people on the left to ignore the issue, hoping they'll go away or somehow concede points, or betraying a minority concern. Sometimes you think you're just trying to avoid it. Sometimes you actively collaborate in conceding points to the people who are against trans people. Parts of the Labour left are doing this over trans rights. There's been various issues with standing NEC candidates where you get people who are openly transphobic who are standing for the NEC, and then some parts of the left think, oh, it's not an issue, don't divide us all, why are you raising this issue, we don't shush, that's not important, let's just all unite. And the truth is, of course, actually, when you're talking about all this stuff, that trans people, if you look at all the surveys, are not actually that unpopular. It's not even that much of a vote winner for the general population, but it is a vote winner for particular kind of base of the Tory party. And then, of course, there's people like Galloway who are openly transphobic, who are just sort of as bad or worse than the Tories on these issues. But we won't talk about him too much. He's not worth it. But it's important to say that these issues are not new. Um, difficult. It was very difficult and unpopular to support Martin Luther King back in the 60s. You know, people think of Martin Luther King as this person that everyone supports. Good old Martin Luther King. He's got his own day now, a holiday in the USA. At the time in the 60s, it was a hugely brave thing to do to stand up and support Martin Luther King, let alone Malcolm X or the Black Panthers. Feminists, when they first started off in the 60s, 70s, and so on, were trivialized as dungaree wearing, bra burning people who didn't shave their armpits. Um, that was all trivial then. And it's sad that a small minority of people who must have gone through that process are now collaborating in the attack on trans people. Back in the 70s, the mainstream straight feminists tried to exclude lesbians because they brought the movement into disrepute, allegedly. Back in Karl Marx's time, hundreds of years ago, it was Irish workers who were demonized, then Jewish workers fleeing from Eastern Europe. Keir Hardie, very early on, in Scotland in the 1860s, one of his early campaigns was to campaign to prevent Lithuanian miners from coming to Scotland and taking jobs. Many US trade unions in the early 20th century excluded black workers. Unions in the 60s in Britain were openly anti-immigration and supported Enoch Powell. There's so many examples of this. I'll just a couple more. In the United States, the women suffragists, the people looking for votes for women in the 1800s, in the late 19th century, didn't include black women in their struggles. They wanted votes for white women. Militant, which is a Trotskyist group that I think I was a member of, and for 10 years, and many people on this call I think probably have some knowledge of, was entirely dismissive of the struggle for lesbian and gay people right up until the late 1980s. Labour leaders in the 1980s were scared of gay rights campaigning, apart from people like the GLC, who were an exception to that. But it's no good blaming the victims of oppression for dividing the labour movement. It's not just wrong in principle, but it's completely ineffective, because if you concede on one point, it just drives the left into apologising or swerving more and more and more. First trans people, then lesbian and gay bisexual people, then women, then black people, then migrants. Well, not then migrants. Migrants are probably the first in the list, to be honest. And they'll never give up, and they'll always find an issue, and we'll always have to concede if we try and avoid issues which are embarrassing or new or difficult to argue. In the late 1960s, the Republican Party in the States adopted what they called the Southern Strategy, which is basically to win the Southern states, the Dixie states, from the Democrats, leading eventually to the victory of Reagan in 1979, 1980. And they did this explicitly by whipping up fears to win workers to vote for them against working class people's intrinsic economic interests. They used race on white fear. They used, including race sex fear, protecting white women from these black people. Religion was used, the Bible Belt, the abortion, anti-abortion feelings were weaponized. General anti-feminism against the permissive society. Of course, then later on, it was against homosexuality and family values, or rather against homosexuality and in favor of so-called family values. Anything other than class. And the joke about this all, of course, is that in the USA, the Democrats were happy to play this game because the Democrats loved it from the other side. They too could focus on all of these identity questions because they wanted class off the agenda. They were an open capitalist party, and they could talk all day about different questions of civil rights and abortion and feminism, but they didn't want to talk about decent living conditions for working class people. And at the same time in Europe, the left, which was based on reformism and on basic Keynesian economics, was beaten in the 80s by Reagan and Thatcher. They were ideologically weak, and they stepped away from socialist class politics, allowing space for workers to focus on issues based around their identity, protecting their own, looking after their own little group, rather than the class as a whole and solidarity. We need a socialist class politics that includes identity issues. We need to unite the class, not based on guilt or workers examining their privileges or blaming white workers for the position of black workers, but uniting workers together. As seen, as I had some small role to play in the miners during the miners' strike in the 1980s, where these principles were initially were thrashed out. We don't want allyship, but we want united class solidarity, because solidarity is in all of our interests. We're not allying to help somebody else. We're fighting the same battle against the same rotten society, all for one and one for all, based on defending all oppressed people. So now turning perhaps to trans issues specifically, we need to take up some of the more common issues that are raised. Back in the day, like trans people were not so controversial 10 or 15 years ago. The Gender Recognition Act of 2004 went through almost on the nod. It gave you the ability to change your birth certificate and, by extension, your wedding, your death certificate, passed easily. It never implied to get a gender recognition certificate, you never needed to have surgery or any other kind of medical treatment, by the way. That's entirely irrelevant. Then later on, 6 years later, the Equality Act was passed by Harriet Harman and Gordon Brown under the Labour government. Again, that was not hugely controversial in society as a whole at the time. It was generally supported. People generally supported rights for trans people to be accepted everywhere as their acquired gender. And it included in the 2010 Act particular exceptions if there was a case of proven risk which needed to be mitigated. If there's no other proportionate way of dealing with a particular risk, it was illegal in terms of that act to exclude trans people if there's no other proportionate way of dealing with it. Again, the rights under that act did not depend on medical transition. You don't need to have had any kind of medical transition to have your rights protected as a trans person under that 2010 Act. But way before 2010, trans people have been using toilets and women's refuges with no great problem. Trans people have been using toilets of their acquired gender ever since ever. Women's refuges had their own robust procedures for catering to trans women. Trans women have been using women's refuges for decades, and plenty of and they've had their own procedures for dealing with any alleged risk that this might create. Prisons also had this. I mean, trans people have been housed in women's prisons for a long time. Not every trans woman gets the right to be put on the women's estate, and generally, there's the robust risk assessments. There was one very celebrated case in 2016 of Kathy White, who did actually attack women in prison. But actually, since then, the procedures were tightened up and lots of lessons were learned from that, and that's fine. So now the actual number, the vast majority of trans women in prison are in the male estate. Only about a dozen or so women are actually in women's prisons. And they've all had to go through the risk assessments. The famous case in Scotland of the rapist, she never ever was in a women's prison. She was in solitary confinement in a women's prison, but in solitary confinement and then transferred to a men's prison. So that was another complete non-issue that was raised to demonise the self-ID proposals of the Scottish Parliament. But then everything changed. In 2017, there was a very modest proposal to change the gender recognition procedure to self-ID, to do away with all the complex medical procedures and panels and sending all your paperwork up to a panel and having to wait 2 years. That was simplified. But gender recognition and self-ID had nothing to do with access to women's spaces. It had nothing to do with the medical treatment of trans people. It had nothing to do with the treatment of children or women's sport or anything else. It just made it easier to change legal documents. And yet it became the excuse, which has gone on ever since, for a full-on moral panic, whipped up by exaggerated scare stories, just like the 1980s. But of course, easier now, because now you can just go on YouTube, you can find some silly person saying something a bit silly or looking particularly strange, and then you could blow them up all over the social media. They become representative of the entire trans movement, and they could say something unwise or something they haven't thought through, and it can be spread far and wide. Or if that fails, they can just make it up. They can pretend that children in British schools are identifying as a cat, or they can pretend that people in British schools are being taught that there's 72 genders. All a load of nonsense. Just like in the 1980s, apparently it was illegal in Islington schools to teach the nursery rhyme "Mary had a little lamb, his fleece was white as snow." Complete lie. It was never illegal to teach that nursery rhyme in Islington schools. But there we are. And the mantra so often repeated in all this is that, and it sounds so lovely, it says, "Oh, we're just saying we believe in biological sex." And of course, Who could disagree with that? The belief in biological sex sounds so reasonable, but why keep on saying it? Trans people know very well, probably better than the vast majority of people, about biological sex differences. But to keep on saying it over and over again really can only mean that you only think biological sex is valid. Only biological sex is valid and nothing else is. The actual people identifying a different gender is illegitimate in some way. It's a whistle way of saying that trans people either don't really exist or that they shouldn't exist. They regard being trans as some kind of trivial fashion choice that does not deserve any legal recognition, regardless of how far along a transition someone is. Really, it's a philosophical objection. Either the conservatives, from their own right-wing perspectives, because of their inherent sexism, or some people on the feminist or even the Marxist left have a kind of a radical feminist objection to trans women being men. If you define the enemy of women as men as such, rather than oppressive class or sexist society, but men as such, anybody who has a penis or has ever had a penis becomes the enemy. And that's the philosophical objection. And they look for other examples to justify that. They attack gender ideology, which really is a meaningless euphemism. What they really mean is the right of trans people to live in their gender identity. They disagree with the right of trans people to go around their daily life. If you look and identify like you're a woman, that you should go along and use the facilities appropriate to the gender you have adopted and the gender you've always had, you could argue. Anyway, since the big moral panic over that, they've been slowly but surely rolling back trans rights for in schools, in hospitals, in toilets, and now you have the prospect actually of another 5 years of Tory government is genuinely terrifying for trans people. I know enough trans people now to know that people are completely terrified of the prospect of this carrying on. So those people who say there's no difference between a Labour government and a Tory government, Labour's really not that good on the issue, but my God, they're not as bad as the Tories are. And of course, after all of this, there is just no evidence that trans people are using facilities of their gender identity causes any harm. Self-ID is irrelevant. You don't need to show a birth certificate to use a toilet. You don't need to show any kind of certificate. So whether or not you possess this GRC certificate, whether or not you've used self-ID to get it, is entirely irrelevant.